Welcome to Between Shelves.
where we make connections between literature, theology, philosophy, psychology, and culture.
Join us as we explore the interconnectedness of race, spirituality, psychology, and meta-modernism.
Each episode invites you into a thought-provoking journey, unpacking how these elements shape our understanding of the world and ourselves.
My name is Aaron Waldron. We're a religiously traumatized theopoet and a shaman in journey. Our work focuses on creating community and between spaces for religiously traumatized millennials, navigating life beyond colonized religion.
And my name is Rafael Reyes. My work is on the importance of imagination and theopoetics in philosophy and religious pluralism.
We invite you to Between Shelves
To learn,
listen,
and become.
Hello, everyone. How is everyone doing?
Welcome back.
Yeah, this is our third podcast, so that's awesome. We're happy to have you join us and spend some time as we talk about some of the cultures and the new rise of meta-modernism and how that engages with religion, philosophy, culture, psychology. And so glad to have you. I think just as a recap, the first two podcasts that we had were on race and modernity, and then spirituality and modernity. And I think that was really to ground ourselves on what meta-modernism is trying to do, which is sort of like this culmination of both modernity and postmodernism, or at least grabbing from both of them to say, okay, what's good from both isms that we can bring in to ours and then make some corrections and move forward. And I think we have done enough on modernity. We could always do more. We could always talk more. But, we're going to move on. Right now, we're going to enter into post-modernity, what it is, some of the key ideas behind post-modernity, what it was trying to do, and see what are some good takeaways as we speak about race. So, Aaron, do you have any just beginning inklings on your thoughts of what postmodernity is?
For me, the one thing that stands out is postmodernism is more focused on deconstructing. So for me, I think about deconstructing one's identity, one's history. So for me, it's been definitely a path or a journey of self-discovery, but also considering all these different components that affect me. I'm more of a mix, so I don't come from just one lineage. And so it makes it very complicated to figure out where my origins are. But yeah, in postmodernism, for me, right now, I'm trying to figure out who am I beyond slavery, before slavery, So, yeah.
That's awesome. I think just to offer some context on transitions, if we were to look at a historically linear timeline, postmodernity really blows up post World War II. In World War II, all of the horrific events and the catastrophes and everything that happened there really started to make a large number of the population really question the idea of truths and grand narratives, meta-narratives, and this modernist thought. And I think with that comes this new array of authors and scholars that really are trying to deal with what is it that we are seeing in society. This is where we get I think this is Sartre and Camus. We're now talking about authors such as Jacques Derrida, Gilles Deleuze, Julia Kristeva, Jacques Lacan, and these authors that are coming out of the French, these are mostly the French authors that I'm familiar with, post-modernity and post-structuralism. But World War II really sort of sets the tone, sort of like, oh my gosh, I thought we were a superpower and we are not. And so it kind of jostled not only the people of the United States, but people all over the world. And really started to question this notion of meta narratives, truth, really bringing in a form of skepticism. And that is what postmodernity is. That's what postmodernism is, really. Postmodernity, I can argue, is sort of like these thoughts and ideas in day-to-day life and the films and all of that stuff. But postmodernism as a way of thinking, is really the key piece here. People are starting to lose faith, if you will, if I can say that. And I think that's where postmodernity gets these key ideas. I had written down some of them. Number one, postmodernity is anti-foundationalist, means there's no solid foundation, or like this one true foundation. There's no such thing as a grand narrative, right? There's no overarching story that defines who we are as a people, that defines who we are as human beings. There's no essentialism. And this is really important when we start talking about essentialism, because essentialism is where we start talking about identity. But essentialism is those things that are inherent within us that are unchanging. So that if we're Latinos, there's this unchanging property within us that's inherent, that's not brought about by history, but is brought about by something else, right? That essentialness. So there's no essentialism. And there's no determinism, which means all events are predetermined. So postmodernity is sort of really kind of pushing back or smacking in the face, maybe religion and some of the aspects that it's throwing out. It's smacking in the face a little bit of Rome and Greece, which talked about fate. And right, there's these things that are determined, and all of that nature. So it's doing a lot. Postmodernity it was effective in causing a stir, because now it's starting to kind of really say, everything that we once thought is just not true. And pushing us to say, well, then what is true? And that has interesting implications when we talk about race and even when we talk about spirituality. But I just wanted to kind of pause there and see some of your thoughts as I was talking.
Yeah, as you were talking, we were thinking of Bell Hooks as an incredible author and contributor to this kind of thinking. She wrote two different books, many books, but these two particular books stood out to me. Yearning, Race, Gender, and Cultural Politics, published 1990, and Black Looks, Race and Representation, published in 1992. And so Hooks, she was critiquing how race and representation are intertwined in cultural narratives. These overarching grand narratives that we're talking about in postmodernism that are, not helpful, but tend to make it a little bit more complicated. She was going a step further, trying to deconstruct that even further. You know what I mean? Like, what is this overarching narrative? Is it possibly a colonial narrative, an oppressor narrative, a slave master narrative, And so we have to be careful that these grand narratives are not acts of superiority, or reflections of superiority. And because if we do that, then we fall into, we don't really have freedom or control over our own livelihoods and our choices. We're just following. We're being told what to do, what to be, how to think. And so Bell Hooks does an incredible job, in my opinion, of trying to navigate race, gender, and culture through these, especially Western world politics and cultural narratives. It's hard to think that your family existed before slavery. That may sound crazy, but how many of us can actually, say that we know that information or know that history or that connection to that time where before colonial imperialistic powers came and said, you can no longer do those things. You do this now because it's proper, pure, the right way, or it's what God ordained. What are your thoughts?
No, that's wonderful. I was also reading Bell Hooks. Bell Hooks is central here when we're looking at postmodernity. She was writing during that time. She actually had an article called Postmodern Blackness. And when you said the book Yearning, what's funny is that in her writing, she says yearning is a powerful metaphor of what we long for in Blackness and Black identity. So, I mean, there's so many parts prior, but I'm going to jump into the Bell Hooks piece and some of the notes I have written down. First of all, I think she does critique, or she does accept some of the critiques of postmodernity. Postmodernism is very academic and it wasn't meant, or it doesn't seem like it was meant to be like in the populist areas. We only have versions of it, what it looks like in popular spaces. And she goes, it's too kind of heady, too high. Some of the terms and terminology is there. I want to say something to that really quickly. Postmodernism, post-structuralism, postmodernism and postcolonialism is some form of post-structuralism. Post-structuralism was meant to, is frames of thinking that pushes back on the notion that if I know a system or if I know the structure, I know who they are. And post-structuralism, in the very, very, specific pieces of what they are and what they are not, highlights that. One of the things that's important about post-structuralism is it's naturally confounding. It's hard, but it's done on purpose because each author is trying to create something new, right? And they're trying to create a language. They're trying to create new words and new meanings to push back on systems and saying, no, this is what it means, right? So, instead of having a system that says, hey, this is what it means, and that's all it means, and then when you speak, that's what you're saying, post-structuralists, postmoderns, postcolonials, and the return to, let's say, maybe the original languages is a smack in the face of modernity and saying, no, you cannot define what is language. You cannot define what I mean or what this meaning is. Important. So important, right? It's a pushback against colonization. It's a pushback against the colonizer. It's a pushback against empire. So it's so important. And I think that's something that I always want to lift up when we look at postmodernity. It's considered a negative in that respect, but in one way, they're really trying to do something. And so what Bell Hooks does is she at least says, okay, that's difficult. I accept that. I accept all those things. I also accept that we need to be careful with postmodernity because it may be able to maintain whiteness in academia. she offers that critique. So important, it could be so academic, it doesn't make sense, right? And it's only spoken of between white academic elites. But she goes, no, we need to be there as well. If they're defining race, we need to be a part of that conversation. And so for her, she goes, there are some valuable takeaways with postmodernity and the way it handles identity. And she says, we were told who we are, right? We're told who we are. And postmodernity says, no, there's that no one can tell you who you are. You construct that. So if we were to take a moment and think about what identity is, we could probably loosely define it as identity is who we are in our essence, right? That's what word's important, that essence, that sort of like that central piece. And that's where we get our values and properties and things of thinking from. Postmodernity says there is no such thing as an essence or an essentialness, but that who we are is based on the relationships we have, the events we've been through, the things we've read, the families we've been in, the context, all of that multifaceted things, our history, make up who we are, and we're constantly changing. So our identity becomes fluid and dynamic and is not fixed. That is so liberating in a sense, because if we're looking at pre-Civil War, when we're looking at the time of slavery, and they look to Scripture, and they say, this is you. You are the slave. You are the sinner. You are this. If we look at, let's say, in terms of the Holocaust, and they're creating these experiments to say, oh, because their brain is smaller, they're more or elongated, that makes them dumber, right? And all of these are what we call fixed. These are things that are fixed based on one's biology, right? When we talk about skin color, it's fixed on some values of a meta-narrative that will then say, okay, so then this is who you are. You are sinner. You are black. You are slave. And so on and so forth. So postmodernity says none of that. There is no such thing as a meta-narrative, number one. And number two, there's no such thing as essentialism. And so if there's no such thing as essentialism, that there's this essence of who you are that maybe comes from the divine, that means you are not slave. You are not bound to these things, but that you are and can become whatever you identify as, what you want to be. Bell Hooks grabs on that. She goes, man, that's liberating. She does bring a word of caution. She goes, we can argue that it could mean, man, I'm trying to find my identity. Postmodernity says I don't have an identity or a fixed one. What's that? She goes, but no, we shouldn't look at it that way. Well, how we should look at it is like, man, I get to research. I get to see who I am. I get to look at my history, and I get to become what I want to be. That is liberating. That is liberating. And that means we could also be multifaceted. We're not bound by anything. And I'm using bell hooks here, and also there's an article or a chapter in a book by an author by the name of Arnold Farr. The chapter is called "The Specter of Race." The Specter of Race: Bell Hooks, Deconstruction, and Revolutionary Blackness. So when we're thinking about this identity, the ability for us to say, I can choose my identity. I can be who I am, and I'm not bound by this a particular value or only looking at this lens. That can be liberating. That's adventurous. I use a Whiteheadian term, this notion of adventure of ideas, this adventure of the formation of my identity. So that's something that bell hooks grasps onto in postmodernity and says, man, that's awesome. It allows for fluidity, gender fluidity, right? We're not bound to be male or female. It could honestly say, hey, I am multi-race. I have mixtures of, African, Taino, Spain, Turkish, Jewish, and really allows, then that's from looking at it from a biological standpoint, says, I'm dynamic in that sense. My identity is not bound by one location in one space, but I have these other spaces that make up who I am. And really then becomes an argument that I don't even know if I can call myself just this, right? I'm only Puerto Rican. But Puerto Rican is where I'm coming from. That's my history. So I'll hold on to that for a while. There's, and this idea of a decentered subject or the crisis or the identity it was really meant in postmodernity to be freeing and liberating. Unfortunately, it hasn't worked out that way. Having the subject as decentered probably has caused a lot of trouble, because then it says, then who are we? Probably we haven't been taught, well, how do I find myself? I think that's really a good metaphor, an analogy to say that, how do I find myself? And so then what I think happens is that it doubles down on returning to old patterns, old centeredness, and why there's such a rough critique on this. But nevertheless, we see from this decentering of the subject, post-colonialism, decolonialism, acolonialism, these frameworks that are so valuable in academia and outside, as ways of critiquing colonization, the colonial rule, and really finding ourselves again. I think what we, and I'm going to pause so if you can chime in. What we're getting is, the fear that there is a tribalism, because now we're packing ourselves into certain groups and says, okay, I'm Taino or I'm Puerto Rican. Not many else can fit in that group. And we subjectivize ourselves, or we break ourselves so much that we don't find our relationship or connectivity in others, or cannot join or unify around a certain idea to move forward. And I think that's another, if we were to look at another critique of postmodernism, or its outcome, is that it hasn't been able to do that because its role is something you said. It deconstructs. And I'll pause there and let you talk a little bit.
Yeah, no, you bring up a lot of great points. But for me, I think one thing that really stood out to me while you were talking was spirituality. It seems like there's a dimension to this that's spiritual. When we think of postmodernism, we started to see it as shadow work. When someone starts to do this shadow work, in spiritual terms, that's just basically going inward towards yourself, or dealing with those darker components of yourself. And then meta-modernism is the opportunity or the space post shadow work, like after you've wrestled with your darker half, after you've gone in the basement and you've sort of navigated some things down there with very limited light. You found yourself not afraid of the dark as much, these kind of things spiritually. What do you do after that? Because it seems like when we're in shadow work, or when we're in deconstruction mode, or postmodernism frame of thinking, we're so fixated on the problems, the issues that need our attention. But then when we come upstairs from the basement, or we come into the light, back into the mundane, the world amongst other people, what exactly do we do? How do we operate? How do we think then? How do we engage? What is sacred now? Because all these things have changed based on us deconstructing, right? And when our frame of thinking changes, our reality changes, the very matrix we're in changes. A lot of people loosely talk about this, right? Like 2025, I'm going to be in a different, realm, or a different dimension of thinking, 5D, and all these are beautiful symbolic terms, just alluding to, I'm going to think different moving forward. I know things now that are different. I'm going to move different. I'm going to engage differently. I'm going to love differently. And that includes ourselves. I know for me personally, 2025, we are definitely further advancing, learning how to love ourselves, and what that looks like. Because we're not always beautiful, like there's elements to us that are ugly, but even in that ugliness, that sacredness there, spiritually speaking, like that's us, and we got to deal with that part. Yeah, we can deconstruct it, but after that, how do we rebuild it? How do we put it back into a new form that suits us or serves us better, so yeah, when you were saying not bound, that was a powerful, for me, powerful term, to not be bound, but to think that even languages bound us, right? I'm always going back and forth. You brought up Taino and being Boricua and Puerto Rican. We have some of that in us, but at the same time, we struggle personally with the language, the language. We struggle with the people that say, you should know the language better, and there's a part of me that's like, I hear you, but the language is the reason why you can't see past yourself or see others in a loving light, not to say that the language makes us bad people, but the language just puts blinders on, if you could see it that way, where we don't see other people, and we don't see how they're in pain in a similar way, or they're dealing with similar challenges. So for me, I'm always considering languages, but how much am I going to invest in that language, so that I don't even get blinded. Hey there, listeners. Dr. Waldron here. If you're enjoying the deep dives in today's conversation, we've got something that might interest you. Throughout this podcast, we mention a variety of books that align with various themes, concepts, ideas, as well as theopoetic, symbolism. Whether we're talking about meta-modernism, psychology, spirituality, film, or even philosophy, by using the Amazon affiliate links we've provided in the episode description, not only can you get your hands on these books quickly and easily, but you'll also be supporting this podcast project at no extra cost to you. It's simple. It's a really simple way to show your support and help us continue bringing thoughtful, enriching content your way. So the next time you're curious about a book we discuss, click the link in the show notes or in the description. And thank you for helping us keep this journey going. With that said, let's get back to the dialogue.
That's an interesting part, because I think post-structuralism language is important. It's not the all end all of things, but there is a lot of emphasis on language, because in languages is how you understand the structure and see how you break from it. And then they can take from other languages and play. I think that if I were to answer that in a postmodern way, I think one of the metaphors of postmodernity is playfulness and creativity. And I think part of the task of any artist who creates, whether they be a scholar writing in culture, philosophy, religion, no matter what, their goal is to create. And they take language of old and they take the language of new and kind of join them together. When we're looking at the need of to know the language of the old, is really to know the history. I always think that that's history. We need to know history. There's no doubt about it. I think knowing our history and knowing the way the language is allows us to be empathetic to it. However, here's the second part. I think, and this is what the centered subject realizes: I'm a relational being, and that means that the other has to also recognize the new language and say there's something powerful there. There's this growth out of it, and so there's that reciprocity and that relational component that says, okay, you might not know the language, let me teach you the language. That's powerful. I think that's where we get into the spiritual of things and the ability postmodernity has. It's, I will say the modern framework and the modern way of doing things was there's a universal piece, you have to learn it. Postmodernity says, oh wow, there's a lot of languages, and I'm never going to get a one-to-one, but this sounds similar to this. And then they listen to it and they're like, man, that's mind blowing. Oh man, that's awesome. And you grow from that. And you see, now we start seeing, wow, our identity does shift and our identity does change because maybe I've gotten a little bit closer to being a Taino, or maybe a little bit farther away. Maybe I'm hurt by it, or maybe I was healed by something. Maybe I took on a metaphor or an analogy that someone told me, maybe from a story from an African proverb, that changes my identity of who I am in some ways. So there's that. That's powerful. That's powerful. If you don't mind, I just wanted to highlight maybe, some things that postmodernity does talk about, and maybe another caution that meta-modernism is trying to correct. There's another author by the name of Lyotard, Lyotard, forgot his first name off the top of my head. And he really kind of establishes postmodernity. And one of the things he really pushed against was the idea that there's this one overarching meta-narrative. So I'm coming back to that. This idea that there's this one story that fits everybody. That's problematic, right? I'm born and raised Christian, Pentecostal. But even he would argue that has cracks. Christianity has cracks. So when you study Christian history, you start noticing, oh my gosh, there are a lot of cracks. I want to make that note. Christian history is ugly. I just finished teaching that class to my students, and it is ugly. It's not pretty. There's beauty in it, but in that beauty, there is a lot of ugliness in it as well. But this idea that there's an overarching story that governs it all, or that covers it all, is just not there in postmodernity. And he says meta-narratives have lost their power and their legitimacy. And what we need to start emphasizing are little narratives, or the smaller narratives, to push against these meta narratives. We have an author by the name of Michel Foucault. He takes on that. He holds on to genealogy, which is that study in archaeology, to find marginalized knowledges and see where those cracks arise within the universal knowledges. I mean, this is key. This is so helpful, right? How will we have known? Once again, I'll stay within my context as a Puerto Rican. I didn't know that the United States, I thought the United States was doing a grand thing. Didn't know that the United States came in and were testing out IUDs on women when they were giving them a gynecological exam, and knocked out a whole generation of Puerto Ricans. And we're not told. I wasn't aware until, we start researching of how the rise of diabetes and other health conditions did not come out of our own, from our own eating. But when we took on the FDA's model of what's healthy eating, and then they brought to us canned foods and things of that, highly processed foods, which we know now is destructive for our bodies, and causing a lot of the health concerns that we see in Puerto Rico. So this idea that we need to return to these are the narratives that make us who we are, these smaller narratives, to understand diversity and difference is key in postmodernity. This idea of having local and contextual knowledge. But what that does, it moves us away from any types of supernaturalist thinking. It makes us more secular and more subjective. And I think that's where a problem could arise, or this is a critique, because we've gotten more secular, because we've gotten more subjective. We've lost maybe a central way of thinking, like, right, a goal moving towards, and we've just gotten insular. We've gotten super subjective. This is all about me. This is only for me. And we can't think outside of that. I'm going to get a job because I'm going to make money. I'm going to make sure I make the most money. I don't really care about the person next to me. I could be a good friend to them, but I'm not worried about their fiscal responsibilities or how they're doing or anything like that, and so on and so forth. That is an effect of postmodern thinking because it's gotten ultra subjective. I think an example of that on a large scale is when we say, let's say if we're looking at someone that's a stockbroker, and then the stockbroker, they say, your job is to make sure that I make as much money as possible in stocks, without worrying about any of the ramifications of putting money into that stock does. Totally subjective. My only job, my only role is that. I only care about me. Why? Because I'm going to get a bonus at the end of the year. So I move out. I remove everything else out, and I just deal with that. That is a concern that postmodernity raises up or builds up. It's a byproduct, if you will, of postmodern thinking, or that's where it moved into. Not that that's what its goal was. In its ideal, it wasn't meant for that, right? But that's kind of where it kind of led to. And if I could say one more thing, it also led to this idea of nihilism, because there's so much meaning, because everyone has all of these different meanings and different knowledges. There's no one knowledge. There's no one meaning. And so everything means nothing. It leads to nihilism. That means you can do whatever you want, and it doesn't mean anything. Byproduct of that, I don't know if you watched, I don't know if it was a 1990s film called Kids. It's a powerful film based on nihilistic thinking, in which a young follows a group of teenagers, and they're doing whatever they want because at the end of the day, it doesn't mean anything. And in particular, this young man is promiscuous and is having sexual encounters with multiple people, and then dealing with the consequences of that, which is there is no consequence. Why? Because it means nothing at the end. It's a powerful film that detects that, that reflects nihilism, and something to think about. You have an author by the name of Francis Schaeffer. The reason why I bring him up because I've read his work, and he really tries to respond to that nihilism that's happening in postmodernity. He's a Christian thinker, and he was trying to offer a response. How now shall we live is one of the texts. I admire him a lot. I don't know if I agree with everything he says, but I do agree with that negative turn of postmodernity. I don't think it was meant to go that route, but it kind of did. And I think those are the parts, nihilism, too much subjectivity and not really thinking about the other, can be a problem in postmodernism. That we have to come to grips with and be aware of. I'll say one more thing and then back to you. I remember something that Dietrich Bonhoeffer said, and I looked up the quote real quick, and he goes, "Let him who cannot be alone beware of community. Let him who is not in community beware of being alone. Each by itself has profound perils and pitfalls. One who wants fellowship without solitude plunges into the void of words and feelings, and the one who seeks solitude without fellowship perishes in the abyss of vanity, self-infatuation, and despair." And that's from his book, Life Together. And I think, postmodernity in some sense kind of missed that mark there in the way it traveled. It got too subjective when it should have been, I'm liberating identity. But I still need to engage with community. I still need to do sort of like that, what we see in the Matrix film, that community that forms when one realizes who they are. But it's not going to be that same structure that happens within the Matrix, right? Hierarchical structures, but this more socialized order that happens there. And brings in a word that I think you like, which is the word trust. So you might want to talk a bit about that.
Yeah, trust is definitely a very interesting term, especially in our last part of the dialogue, last episode. We were talking about spirituality and modernity. Yeah. We were talking about spirituality and modernity, and we were talking about this thing of predictability you mentioned, which is still echoing in the dialogue. And we feel like predictability is connected, quantumly entangled even to this term or this word trust, right? So I think that's very interesting. Please, you want to add something?
I guess a question. You mean the word predictability and the fact that trust is unpredictable, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, sorry for that. Yeah, so to clarify, we were talking about predictability in the sense of the colonizer is in the focus of predicting things or predictable things. They want predictable outcomes. But when we start to see like this more spiritual, kind of individual, self-awakening kind of method, you start to see that you're stepping further into the unpredictable. And that's where spirituality and faith kind of swim together, And so we start to develop this new sense of what is faith beyond predictability. And to tie it in, we come from Christianity, and Christianity, there's a lot of predictability to that. We have calendars, and we have structures and timelines and rituals, and all this stuff is predictable. Every year, there's Christmas and the celebration of the birth of Christ. This is a predictable ritual, a predictable feeling, a predictable time of the year. So there's like this complex, multifaceted event going on,
That's
right?
interesting.
And you have an opportunity now. Well, Empire has an opportunity that they capitalize on. And they say, if you are going to participate in this like clockwork on a predictable pattern, then we might as well capitalize and sell things and profit from the people, because they're in the mood, they're in the feeling, they're in the mindset of this particular thing. And so when we're talking about trust, right? Even right now, as we're having this dialogue in 2024 going into 2025, amongst the people in America, there's a lot of us that are losing trust in things that we should be trusting, right? Like structures and government and authorities, and uh, even police, right? That's been questionable for some time now, since the beating of Rodney King. So this idea of trust, it takes a lot. And when we start to step away from things that we used to trust, we kind of are traumatized. I think you were alluding to this, that how do we now even reconstruct this idea or ability to trust in anything, because we're so traumatized by not being able to trust things, And so I guess in Christian terms, if Jesus or Yeshua were to show up today, would you really trust that figure, that symbol? Because you've been so hurt and lied to so much, you may not even be able to recognize, um, divinity in the flesh like that, or a person that has a lot of love to offer, or a lot of truthful things to offer you. You may not be able to recognize them because you're so battered and hurt from the manipulation, the lies, the constant lying to your face. What does that do to the psyche, after a while? We can see this even in behavioral patterns. And this is something we were thinking of when you brought up the film that you brought up. We thought of A Clockwork
Yes.
Orange. Have you seen that?
Oh,
Yeah.
great film.
1972. Yes. And that's really focused on behavioral patterns and how, it affects humans, right? So you have the main character kind of having this, I don't care about nothing. I don't care about anything. I don't care about the repercussions. I don't care about pain or suffering. And, and he was the leader of a gang, and they were doing gang things. But it's not until he was incarcerated and they offered him this kind of program where they try to modify or change behavioral patterns based on simple things like pain, and it's so interesting because we are behavioral beings like that. Like we rely on patterns of behavior, and we can alter them based on trauma or exposure to constant changes in your environment, even, you know what I mean? Like we see this even in animals. So it's really interesting for me, to think about it in the sense of, what do you trust, and how does one even begin to trust themselves if the systems prior never prompted us to even begin thinking that we could trust ourselves, because it was really focused on us trusting them, you know? What do you think?
No, there's tons of things that I'm thinking about as you were engaging. I think number one, you mentioned an interesting point when we're talking about trust. We lose our trust, right? Because we've been traumatized, let's say within religion, we don't know what to think anymore. And um, Jacques Derrida, talks about something similar to that. And he goes, the difference between the Messiah and the Messianic. He goes, we can be so we can always be looking for a Messiah and missed out on the messianic. We're always looking for this. It has to look like this. When what we should be doing is saying, no, here are probably some of the principles of what the messianic would look like, which then borders on trust. I have to trust that what this person is exemplifying really relates to the messianic, rather than it being a white man coming in with a Cadillac, or these days it would be a Tesla, coming in and doing stuff. And so he says it's that messianic that we should be looking for, and not that Messiah. He shouldn't look like us, the one to bring hope and restoration. If so, it's always looking for the messianic. So I was sharing that. I think another part of trust, and you're alluding to it very much. Trust is something that is not in ourselves. It's not subjective. It's actually letting go of everything of ours and saying, I gotta trust you that you're going to say what you're going to do. Catherine Keller kind of talks about that in her work, in one of her systematic theology books, but she uses the term fuzzy logic. It's truey, but it's not like really true. We kind of have to trust, that what the person says is true enough, and can no longer just be us and assurance. You kind of do have to take it on faith. You have that kind of piece. When we're looking at the matrix, when they are in the society that they're in, and they have to trust one another to do the work that they need to do. I'm here creating rockets to fight against, the robots, and this group is preparing to do this, and this group is preparing the food, and we trust in one another. There's actually even a trust in machines in the matrix, that they're doing water reclamation and water filtration. We kind of, in that discussion between one of the I forgot what they're called, but it was Neo and this other man. And he goes, we could shut them off when we want. Yeah, but then we'd have to really think about how we're going to get clean water, how we're going to get power. We have a trust. We trust that they're going to do this all the time. And this word in particular, and for this discussion, actually comes out of an author by the name of Ihab Hassan. He wrote a chapter called Beyond Postmodernism, Towards an Aesthetic of Trust. I love the fact that he uses aesthetic of trust, because aesthetic is art-based, right? It's poetic. And therefore is not put in mathematical terms. It's not put in those type of literal terms. And that means it's something that's kind of felt. It's something that we kind of realize, something that forces us to slow down and think about in order to grasp at it. It means we have to wait, right? We got to wait for the other if we're going to trust on them. All of those pieces. So it's an aesthetics. It contains all those components. We have to wait for the artist to finish painting or structuring the piece, and all those components. So I say that there's some beauty that comes out of postmodernity, and we have some beautiful authors that come out of postmodernity, but it's not without its risks, and it's not without some of the realities of what came out of it, which was there was a form of nihilism, in which, we have so many meanings that we don't have this one central one that we can surround and join in, unless we look at authors like Gilles Deleuze and Roland Faber, who say we must surround ourselves or surround the notion that we are different, so that difference is the unifying factor. And we can go from there. But still, we have to deal with, well, how do we talk about that when we're in a political space? How do we talk about that in any of these other venues, right? Difference isn't enough, maybe. What does difference look like when we have like a food scarcity? We're not going to give away just cans of canned meat when there's groups that can't eat meat or can't do this or can't do that. You know, that's a simple example, maybe a dumb example, but it's an example of how do we turn the notion of difference into something more concrete that we can rally around to be able to talk and resolve. That's the weakness of postmodernity, because its goal was to, like you mentioned, deconstruct as opposed to reconstruct. So nihilism, this idea of they don't, there's no way of thinking about how to reconstruct things, because I don't think that's postmodernity's or post-structuralism's job. This idea of the crisis of identity in crisis, you know, it allows for freedom and there's a liberation of it, but maybe doesn't provide a guide as to, well, how does one find identity? Because its goal is to free oneself, to reveal some of the power structures, some of the hidden meanings behind certain things, so that you can become aware and be like, well, screw that, I don't want that. It never tells you, well, what should you look for? And things of that nature. And I think that is where there's there's that aspect of postmodernity or post-structuralism that now we're moving beyond. That if I could just say one more thing, I know I've been taking so much of the time. You know, in the book, there's a book called Supplanting the Postmodern. They were actually 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 different terms of what comes after postmodernity, of which meta-modernity seems to be holding on. But there was hypermodernism, performatism, automodernism, renewalism, altermodernism, digimodernism. But right now, what's holding is meta-modernism. So I just wanted to make that note.
Yeah, that opens up a whole nother can of worms. Thank you though, but oh wow. When you were talking, we were thinking of maybe for our listeners that are still in religion and, you know, trying to maybe navigate a little bit beyond, using these analogies out of the Bible, right? A simple one such as the Exodus, right? And this myth or this story, this sacred text, has been in the background of our dialogue today, and you can see it in the sense or in the framework of while the Jews or the Israelites were in Egypt, they were going through a process of post-modernism. They were deconstructing, trying to point out what's wrong and what needs to change. And then the part of the story where Moses, as a critical leadership figure, comes into play is then in this crisis, an opportunity arises where you can now, you know, rebuild, reconstruct, but it's going to be out in the desert. And then this notion of the promised land. For a while, we were looking at it, looking at the surface level of this term, but it seems after having this dialogue, there's another layer to this term, the promised land. It's actually not predictable, even though it's using the word promise, you know, which can be kind of confusing. You think something that's promised to you is predictable, expected, right? Guaranteed. But this promised land actually wasn't a destination, but actually a metaphor to an ongoing process, right? Striving to find something that's always better and sacred and more divine, and it seems like it was further away from the centralization of society, like Egypt at the time. Was a central hotspot, bringing all these people together, whether they wanted to or not, right? The centralizing of people we see when it goes too far, right? It's harmful. But then there's an aspect that's not too far of centralizing that brings us together, like gatherings and families, stuff like that. But when we see it on these larger levels of society, we have stories like this, testimonies, myths that remind us that, uh, you know, sometimes we have to step into the unpredictable in order to appreciate the things that were predictable. Um, and at the same time, push us to think beyond what we're given. Like Egypt said, you guys are just slaves. You'll always be slaves. And then Moses comes in and gives them an opportunity to say, you're more than just a slave. Better yet, you're a child of God. That's how beautiful and loving and powerful you are. And that's how much you're loved. Even though you've been in this state of slavery and you think that because the Egyptians would remind you with their language and their rhetoric that you're beneath them, in actuality, there is no hierarchy. We're all from this source, this God. And so the myth, you can see, we can deconstruct it and then reconstruct it in a way that helps us see this phase or this process of transitioning from postmodernism to even metamodernism in a way of thinking. You know what I mean? What did you think of that?
That's awesome. That's awesome. No, I love it. I love it. You actually got me thinking about another scripture verse, and so I was just holding. I was like, I'm gonna wait because I like this analogy and this way of using that particular text to talk about how we move from a modern to a postmodern, then to a metamodern, right? Because you have a way of saying, here's this overarching way of thinking and breaking away from it because we have God working in and through Moses. But there is this postmodern feel of who are we in the midst of that wilderness that you're speaking of, right? And there is an identity crisis there. This return to Baal as a past way of thinking, right? And then in the wilderness, what's beautiful about wilderness, if we look at it from a myth perspective, as you were saying, is that wilderness usually is symbolic of that journey, that journeying, sort of like using the imagination, using that space to kind of really think through and struggle with what we're struggling with. And in one essence, you can say it was a struggle of identity. Who are we as a people? Who will we hold on to? How will we establish our faith and trust? It is there that they slowly build the 12 tribes, where they have an altar, and they do that. So they move and they become and they form identity there. You can sort of say that has the inklings of a meta-modernity, a different people, different brothers, and yet still gathered and rallying around this one divine being, this encounter. And so there's beauty in that. That's a powerful component there. If I can throw one at you, I was looking at Luke 18, verses 35 through 43, and it's the blind beggar who receives sight. Why do I like that one so much? I think that's very postmodern in this one aspect. The blind beggar, in his social context, he's blind. So we know once you're blind, guess what? There's only one thing you can do for the rest of your life. It's to beg. That, though, was placed upon him by society. So who is the one that is defining the value of a blind person? Well, it's societally. The society is saying, you're blind, you're a beggar. That's the best you can do. And that's time in and time out, all that can be done. He has no say in that. He has no say in that whatsoever. So when Jesus comes, he says, Hijo de David, ten piedad de mí. My God, my God. No, son of David, have mercy on me. The guy had no inkling of what was going to happen post anything that would happen. But at the moment of his being healed, the moment that his eyes are opened, that he's awakened, we don't hear anything else about him. But I can officially tell you that his life is officially ruined because he is no longer blind. He is no longer a beggar. What the heck is he going to do? But he leaves happy. He leaves rejoicing, which for me is a postmodern sense of I get to explore my identity. I get to finally explore who I am. And I'm not confined by this blindness, but I have a new set of tools now that I can work with and explore and adventure. I think that's powerful. I think we can use that in a postmodern way to talk about that lifting of the veil, that wokeness, this idea of now I can engage more, and once again, it changes my identity of who I am. I know. So two great verse scriptures that play with modernity, postmodernity, and what can be used to.
Yeah, definitely. I love that scripture, by the way. That's a great addition because you're right. We see it very vividly. Because when you think about it, right? Think about it from like a everyday practical lens, right? A man is blind. Let's say he's literally blind, right? And somehow you make his eyes work where he can now see the world, right? You would think like, oh my God, this is great, right? But in practical terms, this is traumatizing, right? This person has never seen light, maybe. This person has never seen colors. You know what I mean? So like to see that immediately and now be able to see and experience from a whole new, that's traumatizing. It's like you've elevated in altitude too fast. And we all know through science what happens when you go too fast up, and so again, it's pain in that. Like it's not healthy. It's not supposed to be something that's incredibly powerful in that sense. It's supposed to be something that's like, oh, wow, this is a whole new way I got to look at things, And to add, ignorance is bliss. So the man was blind. Now he can see. Do you really think he's going to be living in heaven on earth? Or does he have an opportunity now to see like, damn, I've been surrounded or living in a really messed up world? Like, and my blindness made me see only one aspect of society. From a begging standpoint, life can be great. I'm sorry. I'm not saying everyone should go begging, but if you were to empathize, I beg to get and receive, and people just give it to me. What else do you have to look after? Like your life is pretty much, good at that point, but when you now see you have to now provide for yourself, you have to now go get a job, you got to clean yourself up, you probably got to go back to school. There's no more begging, you know what I mean? And life becomes hella complicated. You got to pay taxes now, whereas the empire was like, oh, you poor thing, no taxes for you here, Now it's like, oh, you're a capable person, taxes, like we're going to hold you to the law because you're capable now, or you're sane enough or something, or you're not disabled enough. You know what I mean? So it's like, that's a really interesting scenario that we can play with to see like, these myths weren't meant, or these sacred texts, weren't intended to be read in a binary way, a literal way. It's definitely highlighting something very complicated. But how do you express complicated things to people that perhaps don't have a high education or something, or they have a very mediocre average education, public education? And we all know through research that's just enough so that you can abide by the rules. It's not really enough for you to choose for yourself or think for yourself. It's just enough so that you can follow the rules. You know what I'm saying? But yeah, beautiful scripture. Thank you for bringing that up.
I think that I think what we're seeing in both modernity and postmodernity, there's so much beauty in these frameworks of thinking, but they're not without their problems. And I think that's where what we'll do is we'll continue in our next podcast on what meta-modernity then is trying to offer. Looking at, looking at the caveats of modernity and postmodernity and what meta-modernism is trying to do. Because there's so much beauty in postmodernity, and I am a staunch supporter of post-structuralism and postmodernity, also very aware of its pitfalls, and I could be idealistic of it, but I really want to honor what meta-modernism is trying to do in offering what that corrective is, and so we need to just talk about that as well. And I think we'll do that on our next podcast.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much for listening in and joining the dialogue. If you missed out on the first and the second, you can catch up so you understand kind of where we've been going with this dialogue. Again, if you like the content, subscribe, like, share. It's all about sharing information. And remember, in the links below, we have affiliate links. So any of the books that we brought up, again, you can find. And if you want to purchase easily, you can. So keep that in mind. Did you have any closing thoughts, Raphael?
I think that I want to just highlight this one thing that Alfred North Whitehead wrote in his essays on philosophy. In every stage, there's a problem, and we bring something to resolve it. But as time passes, those things that we resolved end up being problems in themselves. Modernity was trying to correct something, trying to reveal something, but then it came up with problems. Postmodernity came up to resolve something and to lift up, but also has its problems. And now we're jumping into what meta-modernity might resolve. But I think if anything, if history teaches us, it will always have its weaknesses as well. The idea is always to honor it and to see what it resolves, to answer those questions, and to build, right? I'm going to take a postmodern piece. We're always assembling, an assemblage, a building. And that's going to be the most important part, that we're building one another in knowledge, that we're building one another in developing our identity, who we are in our culture. And that's the best that we can do.